A group of white students never missed an opportunity to bully a black janitor, but they had no idea that karma would soon turn against them and make them regret their actions. How exactly did things change? Find out in this video. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories, and write in the comments where you watch this video from. The prestigious Briarwood High School stood as a symbol of tradition and excellence, a place where the sons and daughters of wealthy families walked the immaculate halls, taking their elite education for granted. Among these marble corridors and grand staircases was a different kind of worker, one who was not greeted with respect or even noticed by most. James Parker, the school's elderly janitor, was a constant, quiet presence, moving about his duties with a quiet dignity that often went unappreciated. James had worked at Briarwood for over a decade, keeping the halls spotless and maintaining the grounds. His wrinkled hands, calloused from years of hard work, moved the mop across the tiled floor with a steady rhythm. The gray in his hair and the lines etched into his dark skin spoke of a lifetime filled with experiences that went far beyond this school's walls. But to the students, he was just the janitor. The racial makeup of Briarwood was overwhelmingly white, and the environment often reflected the privilege and entitlement that came with it. For many of these students, James was seen as someone beneath them, a man whose only role was to serve. It wasn't long before this dismissiveness evolved into something much darker. The subtle sneers and quiet laughs behind his back slowly became more direct insults, comments muttered just loud enough for him to hear as he passed by. "Hey, old man, missed a spot," one student would say, kicking a piece of trash in his direction. "Careful, don't work too hard. Wouldn't want you to break a hip," another would add, their tone dripping with condescension. James, however, kept his head down, focusing on his work. He had learned long ago that engaging with such disrespect only fed the flames. His silence was his shield, but it was a shield that became harder to hold up with each passing day. One afternoon, a particularly brazen group of students decided to take things further. As James was cleaning the cafeteria after lunch, a boy named Trent, known for his cruel jokes and bullying nature, approached him with a smirk on his face. Trent was tall and muscular, the kind of student who used his size to intimidate others. A few of his friends followed closely behind, laughing as they saw what Trent was about to do. "Hey, old man, didn't you learn to clean up your own messes?" Trent sneered as he grabbed a cup from a nearby table and tossed its contents onto the freshly mopped floor. The liquid splattered across the tiles, undoing the work James had just completed. James looked up at the boy, his eyes filled with a calm that seemed to only further provoke Trent. Without a word, he bent down to start cleaning up the mess. As he did, Trent's friends began to kick at the mop, laughing as they spread the liquid around. "Oops, did we make it worse?" one of them mocked. "Guess you'll have to work a little harder, huh?" James's grip tightened on the mop handle, but he kept his composure. He had faced worse in his life. He wasn't about to let a few spoiled teenagers get under his skin. Yet there was a small growing knot of anger and hurt forming inside him, a feeling that, no matter how much he tried to ignore it, seemed to grow each time he was humiliated. Outside of work, James had a loving relationship with his son, Matthew Parker, who just so happened to be the new director of Briarwood. The two had always been close, and Matthew had made it a point to look after his father after his mother passed away. James had turned down countless offers from Matthew to retire and enjoy his later years in comfort. But James was a man who had always been driven by a sense of purpose. He didn't want to sit idly at home. He wanted to keep moving, to continue contributing in his own way. Matthew, although busy with the responsibilities of managing the school, never suspected the extent of what his father was going through. James had kept the bullying and harassment to himself, not wanting to burden his son with the trouble. Besides, he had endured such ignorance and hatred before, during his youth in the military and even upon his return to civilian life. He figured he could handle it, just as he always had. However, the students' cruelty didn't go unnoticed by some of the school staff. A few teachers had seen the way Trent and his friends behaved toward James, but felt powerless to intervene in any meaningful way. The unspoken social hierarchy at Briarwood made it difficult for them to act against the children of influential families. The best they could do was offer James a sympathetic look or a kind word, gestures that, while appreciated, did little to change the day-to-day reality. As the weeks went on, the taunts grew more frequent. The older students, seeing no consequences for their actions, became bolder. One day, a student deliberately tripped over James's mop bucket, spilling dirty water across the hallway. Another time, someone smeared food on the lockers after James had just cleaned them. The aggression was growing, becoming more organized and more targeted, as if testing how far they could push him. Through it all, James maintained his quiet resilience. He would clean up the messes they made, ignore the insults, and continue with his work. But each incident took a small piece of his spirit with it. The lines on his face seemed to deepen, and his eyes, once bright with a sense of duty, now often appeared tired and distant. In the quiet moments, when the school halls were empty and only the faint hum of the lights could be heard, James would sometimes pause, leaning on his mop handle as he stared out the window. He would think back to his days in the military, when respect was earned through sacrifice and courage, not bought with privilege. The medals he kept in a box at home were not just tokens of valor, but reminders of a time when he was seen as more than just his skin color. Now, however, he was simply the janitor, a role that came with its own set of unwritten rules that dictated how he was to be treated. James's life at Briarwood was a constant reminder that, even in a place dedicated to education and progress, the old prejudices still lingered. It was something he had always feared, yet expected. As the new generation carried on the same ignorant behaviors of the past, James was left wondering if the world had really changed at all. But despite the growing weariness in his bones and the quiet rage simmering just beneath the surface, James continued to show up every day. His sense of duty, his refusal to be defeated by the ignorance around him, kept him going. Little did he know, however, that the situation was soon to escalate in a way that would force him to confront the demons he thought he had left behind. The bullying didn't just continue, it escalated. What began as sneers and condescending comments turned into more deliberate acts of hostility. Trent and his group of followers, emboldened by the lack of consequences, began orchestrating incidents specifically designed to humiliate James. It was no longer about casual taunts. They seemed to have made it their mission to push him to the edge. One afternoon, as James was mopping the corridor near the science labs, a commotion erupted down the hall. Several students had gathered in a loose circle, snickering as one of Trent's friends, a boy named Kyle, called out to him. "Hey, old man, you missed a spot over here," he shouted, pointing to a section of the floor that had already been cleaned. James glanced up from his work, his calm demeanor unchanged. "It's clean, son. Why don't you move along now?" he replied, his voice steady. Kyle's face twisted into a mocking grin. "Is that so? Well, let's see how clean you can get this," he said as he kicked over a trash can, spilling its contents across the floor. Laughter erupted from the group as James stood there for a moment, the trash now scattered at his feet. James bent down to start picking up the mess, his expression showing no anger, no frustration, just quiet resignation. As he began to clean, Kyle and his friends took turns kicking bits of trash back onto the floor, making it impossible for James to finish. The onlookers laughed, some taking out their phones to film the scene. It was a spectacle for them, an amusing distraction in an otherwise mundane school day. For James, however, it was something more, a painful reminder that the prejudice and ignorance he had hoped would fade over time were still alive and well, passed down to a new generation. But James endured. He had faced worse than this, he told himself. Memories of his military service crept back into his mind, times when he had stood his ground under far more dire circumstances. Those experiences had taught him how to maintain his composure in the face of adversity, and he wasn't about to let a group of teenagers break that. However, the students' cruelty continued to grow. Trent, who had taken the lead in tormenting James, seemed to derive a perverse pleasure from the acts of degradation. It wasn't just about racial hatred, though that was certainly a part of it. It was about power and control. For Trent and his friends, James was an easy target, someone they could harass without fear of repercussions. As the weeks wore on, their tactics became more elaborate. One day, James entered a restroom to clean up after the lunch break, only to find the mirrors covered in crude graffiti. "Old janitor, go back to the ghetto," was scrawled across the glass, accompanied by other offensive messages. It was clear that whoever had done it had wanted to send a direct and hurtful message. James stared at the words for a moment, then took a deep breath and reached for his cleaning supplies. He had dealt with racism his whole life, and though it still hurt, he was no longer surprised by it. He scrubbed the graffiti off the mirrors, erasing the hateful words as best he could, though traces of the message remained etched in his mind. That evening, as James was preparing to leave, a teacher named Miss Collins approached him in the hallway. She was one of the few staff members who seemed to genuinely care about James and had noticed the recent uptick in harassment. "James, are you okay?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "I've seen how those kids have been treating you. It's not right, and I've reported it to the administration, but—" James gave her a weary but grateful smile. "Thank you, Miss Collins. I appreciate you looking out for me," he replied. "But I've been through worse. I can handle it." Miss Collins looked unconvinced. "You shouldn't have to handle it. This isn't fair and something needs to be done," she insisted. James shook his head gently. "The world isn't always fair, ma'am. You and I both know that. I've learned to pick my battles." The conversation weighed on James as he left the school that day. There was a time when he would have fought back, spoken out against the injustice. But he was older now and tired. His battles, he thought, were behind him, or at least they should have been. The bullying continued to escalate over the following days. Trent's group seemed to relish finding new ways to demean James. One morning, they left a fake job application on his cart, suggesting he apply for work at a fast food restaurant because that's all he was good for. Another time, they spilled ink across the floor, leaving it for James to clean up, smirking as they walked away. Yet, through it all, James never allowed himself to show anger. He kept his head down and continued to work, just as he had always done. The small, kind gestures from a few teachers and staff members did little to alleviate the constant strain. He was grateful for their concern, but at the end of the day, he was still alone in dealing with the harassment. The worst incident happened when Trent and his group decided to take things to another level. During a busy afternoon, they waited until James was cleaning one of the more isolated areas of the school, where a few staff members would be around to witness what they had planned. Trent and his friends surrounded James as he was mopping the floor. "Hey, old man, you missed a spot," Trent said, his voice low and threatening. James glanced up, his eyes meeting Trent's with a quiet defiance. "I'm just doing my job," he said calmly. Trent's expression darkened. "Yeah, your job, cleaning up after people like us. Isn't that what you've always done?" he sneered. Before James could respond, Trent lunged forward and knocked the mop out of his hands. Another boy kicked the bucket over, spilling dirty water across the freshly cleaned floor. The others laughed, the sound echoing down the empty hallway. For a moment, James stood still, his mind flashing back to memories of conflict from his younger years, situations where he had been cornered, outnumbered, and forced to defend himself. But this was different. He wasn't a young soldier anymore, and his instinct was to de-escalate, not to fight. He bent down to pick up the mop, his movements slow and deliberate. The laughter died down as some of the students realized he wasn't going to react the way they had hoped. But Trent, sensing that his attempt to provoke James had failed, decided to go one step further. He reached down, grabbed a fistful of dirty rags from the janitor's cart, and threw them directly at James's back. "Clean that up too," he said with a cruel grin. James felt the damp rags hit him, his shoulders tensing as they fell to the ground. The hallway seemed to grow quieter as he stood up slowly. He turned to face the group, his eyes meeting Trent's for a long, silent moment. There was no anger in his gaze, only a profound weariness. "You think you're better than me because you don't do this kind of work?" James asked, his voice steady but carrying a weight that seemed to fill the air. "You think this job makes me any less of a man?" Trent looked taken aback, not expecting a response. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. The silence hung between them, broken only by the sound of distant footsteps echoing through the hallway. James sighed, his expression softening into a sad resignation. "If this is how you get your kicks, then maybe you're the one who needs to think about who you are," he said before turning back to his work. As James resumed mopping, the group dispersed, their laughter subdued. Though he had spoken out, the damage had already been done. The weight of the continued abuse began to show on James's face, in the way his shoulders slumped just a little lower, and the light in his eyes dimmed just a little more each day. The escalation of aggression had reached a point where it could no longer be ignored, and James knew it was only a matter of time before something even worse happened. He couldn't keep this from his son forever, but he wasn't ready to share that burden yet. The thought lingered in his mind as he continued cleaning, wondering how much longer he could endure. The days continued to pass, but the aggression did not subside. In fact, it seemed to grow with each passing week. The group of bullies, led by Trent, found new ways to provoke and humiliate James. What had started as casual taunts and insults now bordered on outright harassment. It was no longer just about words. The acts became more deliberate, calculated, and increasingly cruel. One morning, as James was preparing to clean the restrooms near the gymnasium, he found the door to one of the stalls locked from the inside. He sighed and prepared to crawl under the door to unlock it, but just as he was about to, he noticed something written on the walls. The crude graffiti, scrawled in large letters with a permanent marker, was aimed directly at him. "Get out, old janitor. This place isn't for you," it read, accompanied by slurs that made James's stomach twist in disgust. James took a step back, feeling a surge of anger well up inside him. It wasn't the first time he had encountered hateful messages in the school, but seeing such direct hostility brought memories rushing back. Memories of a time when he had fought against prejudice with everything he had. Yet, here he was, decades later, still facing the same kind of hate, albeit from a different generation. He took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay calm. He retrieved his cleaning supplies and began scrubbing the walls, wiping away the hurtful words as best he could. The task was grueling, and no matter how hard he tried, traces of the message remained, a faint reminder of the ugliness that lingered in the minds of some of the students. As he worked, a few students walked by, sneering as they watched him struggle to clean the stall. "What's the matter, old man?" one of them jeered. "Can't get rid of it?" James ignored them, his jaw clenched tight. He knew that responding would only give them more ammunition to use against him. They wanted a reaction. They wanted to see him break. But James refused to give them that satisfaction. Later that day, as James was pushing his cart down one of the more secluded hallways, he noticed a group of boys huddled together near the lockers. They seemed to be waiting for him, and the moment they spotted him approaching, their laughter grew louder. Trent, standing in the center, turned to face him with that all-too-familiar smirk on his face. "Hey, old man, we've got a little surprise for you," Trent said, stepping aside to reveal a mess they had made. Trash was strewn all over the floor. Crumpled paper, soda cans, and leftover food littered the hallway as if a mini tornado had blown through. James's shoulders sank slightly as he took in the scene. It was clear they had done this just to make more work for him. He felt a flash of frustration and anger, but he pushed it down, as he had so many times before. He took hold of his broom and dustpan, preparing to clean up the mess. As he bent down to pick up the trash, one of the boys kicked a half-empty can, sending it rolling away from James. "Come on, clean it up faster. We don't have all day," the boy taunted. James felt his patience slipping. He was tired of the constant disrespect, tired of the endless messes, and tired of trying to pretend that it didn't affect him. He wanted to say something, to shout at them to stop, but the words caught in his throat. Just as he was about to continue sweeping, Trent stepped forward and kicked over the dustpan, scattering the trash across the floor once more. The boys laughed, the sound echoing in the narrow hallway. "Oops," Trent said with mock sincerity. "Guess you'll have to start over." James straightened up slowly, his gaze meeting Trent's. "Why?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the boy's laughter. "Why do you feel the need to do this?" Trent shrugged, a cruel grin spreading across his face. "Because we can." "What are you going to do about it, old man?" he shot back. His tone was laced with a mix of arrogance and defiance, as though daring James to react. The moment hung in the air, heavy and tense. James stood there, feeling the weight of their eyes on him. Memories of his younger days, when he had fought for respect and endured countless struggles, flooded back to him. He had faced men far more dangerous than these boys, had survived situations where the stakes were life and death. Yet now, here he was, being degraded by a group of children who had no understanding of the struggles he had overcome. "I'm going to do my job," James finally replied, his voice steady but firm. "And I'm going to keep doing it, no matter what you throw at me." His words seemed to take Trent by surprise, and for a brief moment the boy's expression faltered. But then, just as quickly, his grin returned, though it seemed a little forced now. "Whatever you say, janitor," Trent sneered before turning to leave, his friends trailing behind him. As James continued cleaning up the mess, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The encounters were becoming more frequent, the harassment more targeted. He sensed that Trent and his friends were testing boundaries, trying to see how far they could push him. It was as if they wanted to break him, to make him lash out and give them a reason to escalate the situation even further. In the days that followed, the harassment reached a new level. One afternoon, while James was cleaning an empty classroom, he discovered that someone had left an open bottle of bleach spilled across the floor. The strong, acrid smell stung his eyes and made it difficult to breathe. He quickly ventilated the room and set about cleaning up the dangerous spill, all the while wondering how far Trent and his friends were willing to go. This wasn't just about making a mess for him to clean up anymore. It was about putting him in harm's way. After dealing with the bleach incident, James felt a growing unease settle in his chest. These weren't just childish pranks, they were deliberate acts meant to harm and intimidate. Yet, despite the danger, James kept his silence. He didn't want to bring any trouble to his son, and he certainly didn't want to give these boys the satisfaction of seeing him struggle. But then came the final straw. During another late afternoon cleaning shift, James entered one of the supply closets only to find it ransacked. The shelves were emptied, supplies were strewn everywhere, and the floor was littered with broken glass. It was clear that this wasn't an accident. Someone had gone out of their way to make a statement. As he stepped forward to begin the cleanup, a voice behind him spoke up. "Guess you better get started, old man." Trent's voice came from the doorway. He was leaning against the frame, arms crossed, watching James with that same cold smirk. James stared at the mess, his hands trembling slightly as he picked up a broom. He wasn't sure how much longer he could hold back the frustration and anger that had been building up inside him. His patience was wearing thin, and he could feel himself approaching a breaking point. For the first time in a long while, he wondered if he should finally speak up, if he should tell Matthew the truth about what was happening. But before he could decide, Trent took a step into the room, his tone turning more aggressive. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you're just too old to keep up?" James's grip on the broom tightened. He took a deep breath, turning to face Trent, the hurt and frustration evident in his eyes. "You know, boy, it's easy to kick someone when they're down. But it doesn't make you strong. It just makes you a coward," he said, his voice low and controlled. The words seemed to strike a nerve with Trent. His smirk faded, replaced by a look of anger. "What did you just say?" he snapped, stepping closer, his posture more menacing. James met his gaze, unflinching. "You heard me," he replied, his voice calm despite the tension in the air. The hallway outside grew quieter as the confrontation hung in the air. James knew he had crossed a line, but he was tired of standing by in silence. The situation had reached a point where he could no longer ignore the reality of what was happening. It was time for him to take a stand, not just for himself, but for all the times in his life when he had kept his head down and let the world's injustices go unanswered. As Trent stormed out of the room, his friends trailing after him, James knew that the next encounter would be even worse. But for the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of relief. He had spoken up, and it felt like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders, even if only temporarily. The tension lingered in the air following James's confrontation with Trent. Though he had taken a stand, the relief was short-lived. He knew that by speaking out, he had likely angered the boys, especially Trent. James had learned over the years that individuals like him didn't take kindly to being called out for their behavior, and now it felt as if he had only stirred the hornet's nest. Over the next few days, the atmosphere around the school seemed to shift slightly. Though some of the boys kept their distance, others continued their usual antics, emboldened by their leader's silent encouragement. James noticed that the taunts had become more calculated, the harassment more deliberate. It wasn't just about insulting him anymore. They were trying to provoke him, to push him further than they had before. One afternoon, James found himself cleaning the school's trophy case, a long glass display that lined one of the main hallways. It was filled with decades' worth of awards and achievements, from academic accolades to athletic trophies. He was polishing the glass when he heard a familiar voice behind him. "Still at it, huh, old man? Thought you might have retired by now after last week," Trent sneered, his tone as smug as ever. He was flanked by a few other boys, all of whom wore the same arrogant smirks. James continued polishing the glass, keeping his back to them. "I'm not going anywhere," he replied, his voice calm. "Got a job to do." Trent scoffed. "Yeah, a real important job," he said, stepping closer. "Must be nice to have such a meaningful career." James could feel his patience fraying. The boys' laughter grated on him, each chuckle tightening the coil of frustration inside him. Without turning around, he spoke. "It's not the job that defines a man, son. It's how he carries himself." The hallway fell silent for a moment as the boys processed his words. But instead of diffusing the situation, it seemed to ignite a new level of hostility. Trent's smile twisted into something darker. "You think you're so wise, huh?" he said, reaching out and knocking over a nearby trash bin. The contents spilled across the floor, littering the polished tiles. James turned to face them, his eyes steady. "You boys really ought to find a better use for your time," he said, his voice edged with the slightest hint of a warning. He knew he was close to crossing a line, but there was only so much disrespect a man could take. Trent's expression shifted from amusement to irritation. "Or what?" he challenged, taking a step closer. "What are you going to do about it?" Before James could respond, the other boys began shoving more trash onto the floor, making the mess even larger. One of them kicked a soda can, sending it skidding across the hallway until it came to a stop at James's feet. James stared down at the mess, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the handle of the broom. He was a man who had endured much in his life, and he had learned to stay calm in difficult situations, but the constant provocation was beginning to wear him down. His anger flared, not just because of the mess in front of him, but because of the disrespect behind it. The school had always been a place where he tried to make a small difference, even if that difference was simply keeping the halls clean for students. He knew that his job wasn't glamorous, but he took pride in his work. Now, it felt like they were trying to take even that away from him. Just as he was about to speak, Miss Collins appeared at the end of the hallway. She saw the boys surrounding James and the trash scattered across the floor. Her expression hardened as she quickly approached. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her voice sharp. The boys exchanged glances before Trent shrugged nonchalantly. "Just teaching the janitor how to do his job," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Miss Collins shot him a cold look. "That's enough. Get to class, all of you," she ordered. "Now." The boys grumbled, but reluctantly began to disperse, though not before Trent shot James one last glare. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath as he walked away. James remained silent, his gaze following them as they disappeared around the corner. Miss Collins turned to him, her expression softening. "Are you all right, James?" she asked gently. He nodded, though the weariness in his eyes told a different story. "I'm fine, Miss Collins," he said quietly. "Just another day." She frowned, sensing the exhaustion in his voice. "This is more than just another day, James," she replied. "You shouldn't have to deal with this. We need to report these incidents to the administration. The boys can't keep getting away with it." James sighed, leaning on his broom. "I appreciate your concern, but I've seen this kind of thing before," he said, his voice steady but tired. "It doesn't always help to make a fuss. Sometimes it just makes things worse." Miss Collins hesitated, wanting to argue, but knowing he was right, at least in part. The administration at Briarwood had a reputation for protecting the interests of the more affluent families, and Trent's family was certainly influential. "Well, if you change your mind," she said, "please let me know. You don't have to handle this alone." James offered her a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, Miss Collins, but I've been handling things on my own for a long time." As she walked away, James couldn't help but feel the weight of her words. He didn't want to admit it, but she was right. He was dealing with more than just another day. The harassment had become something he couldn't ignore any longer, and the pressure was mounting. That evening, as James sat in his small living room at home, he found himself staring at the box in the corner of the room. It was an old wooden box, worn and scuffed, with a few faded military stickers still clinging to its surface. Inside were his medals from his time in the service, reminders of a life he had left behind many years ago. He hadn't looked at them in a long time, but now, with everything that was happening, he felt drawn to open it. He slowly lifted the lid, revealing a collection of ribbons, badges, and medals resting atop a folded American flag. Each one represented a moment of courage, a story of survival, a sacrifice made. They were symbols of the respect and honor he had earned through blood, sweat, and tears. And yet, here he was, being treated like nothing more than a janitor by boys who had no idea what he had endured. James took one of the medals in his hand, feeling its weight. It was a Bronze Star, awarded for acts of heroism. He thought back to the day he received it, the cheers of his comrades, the salute from his commanding officer. It was a time when his worth was not questioned, when his actions spoke louder than words. But as he sat there, turning the medal over in his fingers, a question formed in his mind. Was it time to fight back? Could he, after all these years of keeping his head down and letting things slide, finally stand up for himself? It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about showing these boys and the school that respect was something earned, not something that could be taken away. The next day, James returned to work with a new resolve. He wasn't going to let them push him around anymore. If they wanted to test him, he would show them that they were picking a fight with the wrong man. He may have been older, but he was far from weak. As he mopped the hallways and cleaned the classrooms, he kept his eyes open, waiting for the next time they tried something. It didn't take long. By the afternoon, Trent and his friends had regrouped. This time, they chose a more remote part of the school, a hallway that was rarely used except by the janitorial staff. It was clear they were trying to avoid witnesses. James was ready. As the boys approached, he squared his shoulders and faced them head-on. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice firm. Trent smirked, tossing a crumpled piece of paper at his feet. "Just came to check if you're still as tough as you think you are," he said. James took a step forward, meeting Trent's gaze with unwavering resolve. "You boys don't scare me," he said quietly, "and I'm not going to let you make me feel small." The group fell silent, the air heavy with unspoken tension. For the first time, the boys seemed to hesitate, as though they were beginning to understand that James wasn't just an easy target. But the hesitation was brief. Trent, unwilling to back down in front of his friends, took another step forward, his fists clenched. Before he could act, James spoke again. "You think this is strength?" he asked, his voice filled with quiet authority. "Picking on a man who's done nothing to you? You don't know what real strength is?" The words seemed to strike a chord. For a moment, the boys exchanged uncertain glances, as if they were questioning whether this was really worth it. But then, in an attempt to save face, Trent shoved James back. James stumbled but didn't fall. Instead, he stood tall, his eyes never leaving Trent's. "I'm not afraid of you," he said firmly, "and I'm not going anywhere." As Trent and his friends turned away, their bravado faded. There was no laughter this time, no mocking jeers. They left in silence, leaving James standing alone in the hallway. For the first time in weeks, James felt a sense of empowerment. It wasn't a victory, but it was a step, and it was a reminder to himself that he still had fight left in him. The days following James's quiet defiance carried a different tone. Though he still encountered the occasional sneer or dismissive glance, there was a noticeable change in the way some students treated him. While Trent's group had not completely backed down, their confrontations had become less frequent, as if James's willingness to stand his ground had caught them off guard. It was a small victory, but James took it as a sign that perhaps he had made some headway, that his silent resistance was having an effect. However, it wasn't enough to stop Trent entirely. The boy's resentment continued to fester, and the more he thought about James's defiance, the angrier he became. It wasn't about the janitor anymore. It was about pride, about showing his friends that he wasn't going to let an old man stand up to him without consequence. Trent had something to prove, and he intended to do so in a way that would send a message. One afternoon, as James was cleaning the gymnasium, he noticed something peculiar. There was a quiet murmur among the students passing by, furtive whispers and glances in his direction. It wasn't the usual laughter or mocking, it was something else. As he continued sweeping, he couldn't help but feel that something was brewing, a sense of unease that settled deep in his bones. It was later that day, while James was mopping the floor near the science labs, that everything came to a head. He heard footsteps approaching and turned to see a small group of students standing just a few feet away, with Trent at the center. The boys had that familiar look of arrogance on their faces, but there was something different in Trent's eyes, something more calculated, more dangerous. Before James could speak, Trent pulled out his phone and began playing a video. The screen showed footage from a security camera, a grainy black and white image of James cleaning one of the classrooms. As the video played, text appeared on the screen. "Old janitor slacking off, watch him pretend to work." The words were accompanied by commentary mocking James's every move, turning a mundane task into a spectacle of ridicule. James's jaw tightened as he watched. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, not from fear, but from a mixture of anger and humiliation. The boys had crossed a line. They had not only targeted him with physical and verbal abuse, but had now decided to turn him into the subject of public humiliation. As the video ended, Trent looked up, his smirk widening. "Seems like you're not as hard-working as you want everyone to think, huh, old man?" he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "Guess you've just been pretending all along." James met his gaze, his eyes narrowing. "You think this is funny?" he asked quietly, his voice trembling slightly with restrained anger. "Recording a man doing his job and twisting it to make him look bad?" Trent shrugged, unfazed. "Hey, it's just a joke. Don't take it so seriously. Besides, who's going to believe you over us?" The other boys chuckled, but before they could continue, another voice interrupted the confrontation. "What's going on here?" It was Matthew Parker, the school's director and James's son. He had come around the corner just in time to hear the last part of the conversation and now stood a few feet away, his eyes narrowing as he looked from Trent to his father. The color drained from James's face. He hadn't wanted Matthew to find out this way, hadn't wanted him to see the extent of the harassment, but there was no hiding it now. The truth was laid bare, and Matthew could see the humiliation in his father's eyes. "What is this?" Matthew asked, his voice hard. He gestured toward the phone in Trent's hand. "Show me." Trent hesitated for a moment, but under Matthew's stern gaze, he handed over the phone. As Matthew watched the video, his expression darkened. He could feel his anger rising with each passing second. The humiliation his father had suffered stoking a fire that burned hot in his chest. When the video ended, he looked up at Trent and his friends, his voice barely controlled. "Is this how you spend your time?" he asked, his tone icy. "Bullying the janitor? Harassing an elderly man just because you think it's fun?" Trent's smug demeanor faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered, shrugging dismissively. "We were just messing around," he said. "No big deal." Matthew's expression hardened, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "It is a big deal, and it ends now." He handed the phone back to Trent, his eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and disappointment. "If I hear about this happening again, if I see any more videos or find out that any of you have been harassing my father, you will all face severe consequences. Do I make myself clear?" The boys exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier bravado vanishing. "Yes, sir," Trent mumbled, unable to meet Matthew's gaze. "Good," Matthew replied curtly. "Now, get to class." The boys quickly dispersed, leaving Matthew and James alone in the hallway. For a moment, there was a tense silence between them, one filled with unspoken questions and a shared understanding of what had just happened. Matthew turned to face his father, his expression softening with concern. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked quietly. "Why didn't you say anything about this?" James sighed, leaning on his mop handle. "I didn't want to worry you, son," he replied. "You've got enough on your plate, running this place and all. I figured I could handle it." Matthew's jaw tightened as he struggled to control his emotions. "You shouldn't have to handle it, Dad. This is unacceptable. I can't believe those boys thought they could get away with this." "I've dealt with worse in my time," James said, his voice steady but tired. "You know that. I didn't want to cause a fuss. Besides, I've always figured that it's better to keep my head down and let these things blow over." "But that's not fair," Matthew replied, his voice growing more insistent. "You deserve better than that. You've earned better than that." James gave him a small, weary smile. "The world isn't always fair, Matthew. You know that as well as I do. It doesn't matter what we've earned or deserve. Sometimes you just have to take what life gives you and make the best of it." Matthew shook his head, his eyes glistening with frustration. "Not this time, Dad. I'm not going to let them treat you like this. Not anymore." There was a firmness in his tone that James hadn't heard in a long time, a determination to protect, to make things right. It was the same resolve that James had once carried in his youth when he had fought against prejudice and injustice on the battlefield and at home. Now, it seemed, his son was ready to fight that same battle on his behalf. Matthew placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "We're going to do something about this, he said. "I'm going to call a meeting with the staff and make sure this doesn't happen again. We'll get those boys disciplined, and I'll talk to the parents if I have to." James's expression softened, touched by his son's determination. "You're a good man, Matthew," he said quietly. "Your mother would be proud." The words hung in the air, filled with a quiet sense of pride and shared loss. For a moment, father and son stood together, bound by a deeper understanding of what it meant to fight for respect, not just for oneself, but for the dignity of others. Later that day, Matthew held a staff meeting to address the harassment. He spoke firmly, making it clear that any incidents of bullying or harassment, especially towards the school's staff, would be met with strict consequences. He emphasized the importance of setting an example and fostering an environment of respect for all. As James listened to his son speak, he felt a sense of pride and relief. Though he had kept his silence for so long, the truth was now out in the open, and the weight of it seemed to lift from his shoulders. There was still work to be done, and he knew that some wounds would take time to heal. But for the first time in weeks, he felt that change was not only possible, it was already beginning. The incident with Trent and his friends had marked a turning point. After the staff meeting, the atmosphere at Briarwood began to shift. Matthew had made it clear that any further harassment would be dealt with severely, and although some students still whispered and exchanged glances when they saw James, there was no denying the change in tone. It was as if a silent message had been sent out. The old janitor was not to be underestimated, and those who had targeted him were now under scrutiny. But James knew that the underlying problem was far from solved. The harassment had left scars, some visible, some not, and there was still a lingering sense of tension in the air. Although Trent and his friends had backed down, James could tell that their resentment hadn't entirely dissipated. Their glares in the hallway and the way they muttered under their breath made it clear that the conflict had not been forgotten. A few days after the confrontation, Matthew came to James with an idea. "Dad," he said one evening as they sat in James's small kitchen, "the school's planning a ceremony for Veterans Day next week. I want you to be the guest speaker." James blinked in surprise, the cup of tea he was holding pausing mid-air. "Me? What would I have to say to them?" he asked, a slight frown creasing his brow. "I'm just the janitor, Matthew." "You're not just a janitor," Matthew replied, his voice firm. "You're a veteran, a hero, and someone who's earned the respect of this community 100 times over. I think it's time they saw that side of you. It's time they understood who you really are." James hesitated, the weight of the past pressing down on him. It had been years since he'd spoken publicly about his time in the military, and even then, he had always kept the details sparse. Those were memories he kept buried, memories of friends lost, battles fought, and a world that had treated him as a second-class citizen even after he had risked his life for it. But now, with everything that had happened, he wondered if perhaps it was time to let those memories see the light again. "I don't know, son," he said, setting his cup down. "I'm not sure it'll make much difference." Matthew leaned forward, his eyes filled with earnestness. "It will, Dad. You've already shown them what real dignity looks like. Now, show them why." James remained silent for a moment, thinking over his son's words. There was a part of him that was tired, weary of fighting battles he thought he had put behind him. But another part, deeper and stronger, felt a spark of something that hadn't burned in him for a long time. Pride. If his story could help even one student see things differently, then perhaps it would be worth it. "All right," James said finally, a faint smile forming on his lips. "I'll do it." The days leading up to the ceremony were filled with quiet anticipation. James spent his evenings preparing his speech, jotting down notes and crossing out lines, trying to find the right words to convey his experiences. He thought back to his time in the military, back to the friends he had made, the losses he had endured, and the hard-earned lessons he had learned along the way. It wasn't easy to revisit those memories, but he knew it was necessary. On the morning of the Veterans Day ceremony, the school was abuzz with activity. Students, teachers, and guests filled the auditorium, their conversations creating a low hum that reverberated off the walls. At the front of the room, a podium stood on a raised stage flanked by two large American flags. Rows of chairs faced the stage, where James would soon speak. He felt a flutter of nerves in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years, but there was no turning back now. As the ceremony began, Matthew took to the podium first, his voice carrying across the room with calm authority. He spoke about the significance of Veterans Day, honoring those who had served, and the importance of recognizing the sacrifices made by military personnel. Then he turned to introduce his father. "It is my great honor to introduce our guest speaker today," Matthew said, his voice tinged with pride. "A man who has not only served his country with distinction, but has also continued to serve this school and its community with unwavering dedication. He is a veteran, a Bronze Star recipient, and someone I'm proud to call my father. Please welcome James Parker." The applause that followed was polite, if not enthusiastic. As James stepped up to the podium, he saw familiar faces in the crowd, teachers who had always shown him kindness, students who had barely noticed him, and, near the back, Trent and a few of his friends, their expressions guarded. James took a deep breath, the paper with his prepared remarks trembling slightly in his hand. As he began to speak, his voice was calm but carried the weight of a lifetime's worth of experiences. "I want to thank you all for being here today," he started, "and I especially want to thank my son, Matthew, for inviting me to speak. When he first asked me, I wasn't sure what I could say that would be of value to you all. But then I thought about the lessons I've learned in my life and how perhaps some of those lessons might be worth sharing." He paused, scanning the faces before him, his gaze lingering briefly on Trent's group. "I served in the military for many years, and during that time I saw the best and worst of humanity. I saw courage, sacrifice, and the bonds of brotherhood that form in the heat of battle. But I also saw prejudice, hatred, and ignorance, things that don't just disappear because you're wearing the same uniform." James's voice grew firmer, more resolute. "When I came back home, I thought things would be different. I thought that the respect I had earned on the battlefield would follow me back here. But I quickly learned that the world doesn't always see you for who you are. It often sees you for what you look like, or where you come from, or what you do for a living." The room was silent, the audience hanging on his every word. "For the past few weeks," James continued, "I've experienced some of that same ignorance here at Briarwood. I've been treated as less than because of my job, because I'm a janitor. But I'm here to tell you that there is no shame in hard work. There is no shame in doing your job with dignity, no matter what that job is." He glanced at Trent and his friends, who shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "You see, real strength isn't about knocking someone down. It's about lifting them up. It's about standing by your principles even when it's difficult. And it's about showing respect to everyone, no matter who they are." James's voice softened as he neared the end of his speech. I don't say these things because I want pity or recognition. I say them because I want you to understand that what you do and how you treat others matters. It matters more than you know." He looked out at the audience, his eyes steady and clear. "So, to those of you who have shown me kindness over the years, I thank you. And to those who have not, I forgive you." There was a long, quiet pause before the applause began. It started slowly, as if the crowd was taking a moment to absorb what had been said, but soon grew louder, filling the auditorium with the sound of clapping hands and murmured approval. As James stepped down from the podium, he felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known in a long time. It wasn't that everything was suddenly fixed or that all the hurt had been undone, but he had spoken his truth, and for the first time in a long while, it felt as if people had truly listened. After the ceremony, students and teachers approached James, offering words of respect and admiration. Some apologized for not doing more to support him, while others simply thanked him for sharing his story. Miss Collins was among the first to congratulate him, her eyes glistening with emotion. "That was beautiful, James," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for speaking out." As he spoke with the attendees, James noticed Trent lingering nearby, looking as though he wanted to say something but was struggling to find the words. Finally, the boy approached, his expression a mixture of shame and uncertainty. "Mr. Parker," Trent began, his voice unsteady, I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I didn't realize." James looked at him for a long moment before offering a small nod. "It takes courage to apologize, son," he said quietly. "I hope you'll remember that." Trent's eyes widened slightly as he nodded in return, his posture less rigid than before. He walked away, and though James knew that the boy's journey toward understanding was only beginning, it was a step in the right direction. For the first time since the bullying had started, James felt a sense of closure. He had stood up, not just for himself, but for all the silent battles he had fought throughout his life. And, in doing so, he had shown the students of Briarwood what true strength and dignity looked like. The weeks following James's speech brought a quiet transformation to Briarwood High School. The echoes of his words seemed to linger in the halls, their impact evident in the way students and staff now interacted. There was a newfound respect in the air, not just toward James, but toward all the school's staff members. It was as though his speech had peeled back a layer, revealing a truth that had been there all along but had gone unacknowledged. Everyone, no matter their role, deserved respect. James returned to his daily duties with a renewed sense of purpose. The students who once barely noticed him now offered polite greetings as they passed. Some even stopped to thank him for his service, both to the school and the country. For the first time in years, James felt seen, not as the janitor or the old man, but as a person of value. The quiet nods and occasional "Good morning, Mr. Parker" were small gestures, but they carried a weight that went beyond words. The transformation extended beyond individual interactions. Matthew's meeting with the staff had prompted a deeper conversation about the school's culture, leading to new policies aimed at promoting inclusivity and respect. Anti-bullying initiatives were reinforced, and the administration made it clear that harassment of any kind would not be tolerated. Assemblies and workshops were organized to discuss the importance of empathy and understanding, and the events surrounding James's speech were cited as a turning point. However, there were still remnants of the past to address. For James, the real test came when he encountered Trent in the hallway a few days after the ceremony. The boy had been quieter since the Veterans Day speech, his usual bravado replaced by something more subdued. James noticed the hesitation in Trent's step as he approached, his gaze briefly flickering downward before meeting James's eyes. "Mr. Parker," Trent said, his voice low, "I wanted to thank you for what you said at the ceremony. It made me think about some things." James nodded, his expression calm but firm. "I'm glad to hear that, Trent. Real change starts with thinking, but it's what you do afterward that matters." Trent swallowed, a hint of shame still present in his posture. "I know I've been wrong. The way I treated you, it wasn't right. I guess I was just, I don't know." "You were following a path that wasn't yours," James replied, his tone gentle but serious. "It's easy to get caught up in what others think is cool or fun, but that doesn't make it right. The real test of a person's character is whether they can find the courage to change." Trent nodded slowly. "I'm trying to be better," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Good," James said, offering a small, encouraging smile. "That's all anyone can ask." The encounter left James with a sense of closure. Trent's apology was not just a sign of personal growth, but also a reflection of the larger change taking place within the school. It wasn't a sudden transformation, nor was it complete, but it was a start, a step toward a more compassionate and understanding community. As the days turned into weeks, James noticed other subtle changes at Briarwood. The atmosphere felt different. Lighter in a way that wasn't immediately apparent but was nonetheless real. The sense of division that had once seemed to permeate the air was fading, replaced by an unspoken acknowledgement that everyone, regardless of their role, contributed to the life of the school. Miss Collins continued to check in on James, her concern for his well-being as evident as ever. During one of their conversations, she mentioned how the Veterans Day speech had sparked deeper discussions among the students. "Your words really struck a chord, James," she said one afternoon as he finished cleaning a classroom. "I've overheard some of the kids talking about it, about respect, about dignity. It's had an effect. I don't think they'll forget it anytime soon." James gave a humble nod. "I'm glad to hear that. If even one person thinks twice before acting out of ignorance, then it was worth it." As time passed, James found himself reflecting on the journey he had taken, both the recent weeks and the many years that had shaped him. He thought back to the early days of his military service, to the battles fought and the sacrifices made. There was a time when he had believed those struggles were behind him, only to find that some battles had a way of resurfacing. But now, for the first time, it felt as though he had truly laid some of those burdens to rest. One day, Matthew approached James with an idea. "Dad, I've been thinking," he said, a glimmer of inspiration in his eyes. "The students really responded to your story. What if we started a mentorship program? You could share some of your experiences with the younger kids, teach them about respect, perseverance, maybe even a little bit about what it means to serve." James raised an eyebrow, a slow smile spreading across his face. "You want me to be a mentor?" he asked, a hint of amusement in his tone. "I thought I was supposed to be retiring." Matthew chuckled. "You've been supposed to be retiring for years, and you're still here. I think we both know you're not ready to sit around doing nothing." The suggestion planted a seed in James's mind. The idea of mentoring students, of sharing his life lessons in a way that could positively influence the next generation, appealed to him. He had spent so long thinking of himself as simply the janitor that he had almost forgotten the impact he could have beyond his cleaning duties. The more he thought about it, the more it seemed like a natural progression, a way to continue serving, but in a different capacity. "I'll think about it," James said finally, his voice carrying a note of optimism that had been absent for some time. "But you're right. I'm not quite ready to retire just yet." The mentorship program took shape over the following months, with James at the helm. He began meeting with small groups of students, sharing his experiences, not just from the military but from life in general. He spoke about the value of hard work, the importance of standing up for what's right, and the need to treat others with kindness regardless of their background. His sessions were informal, often held in the school library or outdoors when the weather allowed, but they had a profound impact on the students who attended. For some, it was the first time they had heard such candid stories about struggle, perseverance, and redemption. For others, it was an opportunity to see beyond the uniform of the janitor and recognize the man who wore it. The mentorship program also provided James with something he hadn't realized he needed, a sense of fulfillment that went beyond his daily routine. He found a new kind of pride in guiding the students and helping them navigate the challenges of adolescence and understand the broader world around them. He was no longer just the janitor or even just a veteran. He had become a mentor, a guide, and, to some, a friend. As the program grew, so did Sir James's influence within the school. The students who had once dismissed him as invisible now looked up to him, seeking his advice and listening to his stories. Even Trent began attending the sessions regularly, his earlier resentment replaced by a genuine interest in what James had to say. The boy's transformation was gradual, but it was clear that he was making an effort to change, to be better than he had been. The program's success didn't go unnoticed by the community either. Matthew received several letters from parents expressing their gratitude for the impact James was having on their children. Some of them had heard about the Veterans Day speech and shared stories of how it had sparked meaningful conversations at home. The program was featured in the local newspaper, with James receiving recognition for his service not only as a veteran, but as a mentor and educator. As the school year drew to a close, a special assembly was held to celebrate the accomplishments of the students and faculty. James was invited to speak again, this time not as a guest speaker, but as a valued member of the Briarwood community. Standing at the podium, looking out at the faces of the students who now saw him in a different light, James felt a profound sense of gratitude. He had come to Briarwood many years ago as a man seeking purpose, thinking his best days were behind him. But through the trials and triumphs of recent months, he had discovered that his journey was far from over. He had found a new calling, not in cleaning the halls, but in shaping the hearts and minds of those who walked them. As he concluded his speech, James's voice carried the weight of wisdom and the warmth of a man who had found his place in the world. "It's never too late to change," he said, looking at Trent and the other students who had once seen him as nothing more than a janitor. "And it's never too late to learn that true strength lies not in putting others down, but in lifting them up." The applause that followed was more than just polite acknowledgement. It was a celebration of resilience, growth, and the enduring spirit of a man who had spent his life fighting for respect. For James Parker, the journey was not over, but he could finally say that he had found peace. And as the assembly came to an end, he walked away from the podium not as the janitor, but as a mentor, a veteran, and a man who had earned his place in the hearts of everyone at Briarwood. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new episodes. Click on the bell to be notified about our fresh videos. We also recommend watching other interesting stories on our channel. Stay tuned and see you in the next episodes.